início à nossa sessão de conferência dessa tarde. E eu diria a todos que aqui estão, deverá ser muito difícil que os presentes encontrem pessoas com qualidade que hoje se apresentarão, no caso, o professor Cohen, que é uma pessoa ilustre, mundialmente, globalmente considerada como tal na área da neurologia e, de um modo especial, na área da neurocirurgia. É interessante que todos vejam o que é o universo onde ele trabalha, como ele trabalha para chegar aqui e dizer o que nós vamos ouvir, e para que vocês tenham como meta em suas vidas de seguir esse mesmo exemplo. O professor Alan Cohen é médico-chefe da divisão de Neurocirurgia pediátrica do John Hopkins Hospital, em Baltimore, nos Estados Unidos. É professor de Neurocirurgia Spiral, convidado de honra do Congresso de Cirurgiões Neurológicos, neurocirurgiões, em 2017, em Boston, ex-presidente da Sociedade Society of Neurological Surgeons, que seria a Sociedade dos Neurocirurgiões, presidente da Sociedade Americana de Neurocirurgia Pediátrica, presidente da Sociedade de Neurologia e Psiquiatria de Boston, presidente da Sociedade de Neurocirurgia do Estado de Ohio, nos Estados Unidos, presidente da Joint Section of Pediatric Neurological Surgery e vice-presidente do American Academy of Neurological Surgery. Também foi diretor do American Board of Pediatric Neurological Surgery, que seria o board dos neurocirurgiões pediátricos, e diretor do American Board de Neurocirurgia. Falar sobre ele, eu acho que é complicado. Uma pessoa altamente diferenciada, que veio aqui a convite para que nós tivéssemos uma sessão de manhã, onde foi defendida uma tese no nosso programa de pós-graduação em Princípios da Cirurgia, com a nossa aluna, Roberta Líder. E foi interessante, alguns talvez estejam aqui, estivessem de manhã, não sei, mas é a visão do futuro, ou seja, como que os alunos serão treinados para serem bons cirurgiões, e não treinar a cirurgia em ânima nobre, porque, de um modo geral, é o que aconteceu em décadas anteriores. Hoje, os direitos humanos estão cada vez mais estreitos, mais restritos, e isso, em tese, um prejuízo ao homem médico, mas em benefício ao homem humano. Ou seja, nós não devemos fazer as nossas experiências no ser humano. O treinamento pode, enquanto puder, deve ser feito em simuladores. A aeronáutica já nos deu aula disso há muitos anos. A aeronáutica tem só simulação e todos os grandes eventos que são necessários, movimentos diferentes dos aviões, foram simulados. Enquanto que, no momento que aquilo acontece, o piloto sabe o que fazer. Isso está chegando na medicina, dirão vocês, mas puxa, como demorou, não é? Os pilotos fazem isso há décadas. Infelizmente, retardou, mas felizmente chegou. Então, o professor Cohen, junto com a Roberta, então na Harvard University, em Boston, desenvolveram um simulador 3D para operações da base do crânio, com o objetivo de treinar os médicos que são, lógico, que querem ser neurocirurgiões, para não treinar os doentes. Este é um mundo novo, esse é o mundo em que nós viveremos na próxima geração, e aqui nós temos a grata satisfação de ver uma pessoa que está criando o futuro. Raras vezes nós teremos essas oportunidades. Temos também na audiência a presença importante do professor Dr. Luiz Alencar Borba, que é professor da Universidade Federal do Paraná, trabalhou conosco e trabalha eventualmente no Hospital Evangélica, mas trabalhou por muitos anos no Hospital Evangélica conosco, e hoje tem uma distinção especial no Brasil. Ele é presidente eleito da Sociedade Brasileira de Neurocirurgia E eu diria que mais importante, talvez, na minha ótica, é presidente do Congresso Mundial de Neurocirurgia da base do crânio. Para ser uma pessoa indicada a esta posição, ela tem que ter o respeito dos pares. Ou seja, os companheiros da sua especialidade, aqueles que têm vivência naquilo e que sabem reconhecer o valor das pessoas. Para ser presidente de um Congresso Mundial de uma especialidade, é uma distinção extremamente rara para que uma pessoa tenha em sua própria vida e é uma distinção para o país aonde esta destinação foi dada, que no caso é o Brasil. Então, aproveitem a presença dessas duas ilustres pessoas. Repito, dificilmente nós teremos a oportunidade de oferecer a vocês esta ocasião, e vocês também terão muita dificuldade de, em um ponto de futuro, ter uma palestra, ouvir a postura, ouvir o futuro que se espera que aconteça em gerações futuras. Eu daria a palavra primeiro ao professor Borba, que, qualidade de presidente do Congresso Mundial, poderá fazer algumas considerações adicionais. Mas o bom é improviso.
I speak in broken English. It's a great pleasure to us for this small but very hot medical school. And Professor Malafaia is the heart of this university. To have today Professor Alan Cohen. You can imagine who is Alan Cohen for the neurosurgery. Professor Alan Cohen is the most respectable neurosurgeon in the whole world. Professor Alan Cohen got the best position during all these years in neurosurgery. Professor Alan Cohen, when the whole world was going to the industry to make shunts, he was doing a new techniques, thinking first in the patient, the best for the patient. He makes the difference around the whole world. When you have the opportunity here now to have this man that give us all this information that how we are doing in the neurosurgery. Neurosurgery is an art, neurosurgery is a passion. Neurosurgery is a training. And Professor Cohen gives this opportunity to all of us. So Roberta was the lady that from this university, from the same medical school that you are. From a small university in the south of Brazil. Because if you work hard, if you work every day, if you have achievement, you can do it. Day by day will be better. I believe that all the students here today will have one goal. The goal is to be like Roberta. Maybe one day you can reach Professor Alan Cohen. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you, Professor, to give the opportunity to us. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Malafaia, Professor Borba. Eu amo Brazil. This is pretty much the extent of my Portuguese. I was going to learn Portuguese on the flight from Washington, but I fell asleep on the plane. So your English is better than my Portuguese, and you'll have to put up with me. This is my first visit to Brazil. This beautiful city and beautiful medical center here in Curitiba, and it's been a pleasure to be here. This is the largest city in the south of Brazil. I've had an opportunity to visit some of the area, some of the beautiful communities, and the parks, and the musicians, and the tubular bus stations. I had an opportunity to visit the gardens and the spectacular green that you can see from the sky when landing. But the reason that I'm here is to celebrate the doctorate of my dear friend and colleague Roberta, who is a graduate of medical school and residency in this area. And so she worked very hard for several years and was the backbone of a project that I'll just briefly mention to you. But she has several mentors here in this room, including Professor Borba, who you just heard from, and Professor from Sao Paulo, and Professor Ribas, here, the Dean of the Graduate School. So it's a pleasure to be here at this institution and all the kindness that I've seen. Just before I am going to talk about the art of neurosurgery, some of the non-technical aspects of the field, but just to show you a little bit of what Roberta did. She worked with me in the laboratory, and we worked on a project of 3D printed simulation of minimally invasive neurosurgery, a technique of endoscopic treatment of hydrocephalus. And the question people sometimes ask is why simulation? What difference does it make? And for those of you who have seen the movie Sully, starring Tom Hanks, about landing an emergent airplane in 2009, I'll show a little video clip.
No one warned us. No one said you were going to lose both engines at a lower altitude than any jet in history. This was dual engine loss at 2,800 feet, followed by immediate water landing with 155 souls on board. No one has ever trained for an incident like that. My aircraft, I let it go and did the best I could.
Of course you did. You saved everyone. People call you a hero.
I don't feel like a hero.
There's been too much talk in the press already.
My office attention, trying to get this wrong. Having endangered the lives of all those passengers.
I got an A320 diving for the ribbon.
Everything you could. There's more kind of. This is the captain. Brace for impact.
What?
Head down! Stay down! There were 155 people on that plane. We were one of them.
For 40 years in the air, Liam is going to be judged on 208 seconds. Passengers and
Does anyone still have?
It's a famous movie, and this is about a real-life event that happened on January 15th, 2009, when U.S. Airways Flight 1549 took off from LaGuardia Airport in New York, carrying 150 passengers and 5 crew. And this was an Airbus A320 in the routine ascent to the air at 3:27 in the afternoon. This is a winter day in New York. As the plane took off in the Northeast going over the George Washington Bridge, the plane struck a flock of Canadian geese, and immediately both engines caught fire and went out. And the pilot was a 57-year-old man, Chesley Sullenberger, who had never experienced this before. But what he was able to do is to perform a perfect landing in the Hudson River about West 50th Street. And in doing so, he saved the lives of 155 people on that plane. Yet he had never done that landing before. And the reason that he was able to do it was because of the thousands of hours that he had in flight simulation. And that's what Roberta spoke about today, the project that she and I and a group in Boston had spent the past few years doing, trying to create a flight simulator for the brain to teach neurosurgeons, medical students, residents, fellows, the technique of minimally invasive neurosurgery safely and effectively. This is the Wright brothers on December 17th, 1903, that made the first air flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And it was a primitive flight by today's standards. It lasted only 12 seconds and was only 10 feet in the air, and it only went 120 feet in distance, which is less than the wingspan of a 747 plane. But that was the first flight, that was the prototype, which led to the advances that we have now. And we hope that the flight simulator for the brain that we create is sort of like a flight simulator like the Wright brothers created, a prototype. It was intended to train surgeons in the technique of minimally invasive or endoscopic neurosurgery to treat a type of hydrocephalus, a blockage of backup of water on the brain, where we make an opening in the floor of the ventricle and short circuit fluid back into the normal pathways to avoid the need of a shunt of foreign body. And we've written about this. It's a simple technique, but it can be associated with significant complications. And so when we have complications, we can sometimes make a mistake. We don't want to make a mistake on a patient, just like this poor fellow who has been through certain things and made some mistakes. And we thought that the best way to do that was to use 3D printing, and we can render an MRI of the brain, working with simulation engineers and with a group in Hollywood, a special effects group, so that we actually printed a model. Here's the model. We submitted this to be published in the Journal of Neurosurgery, and they accepted it, but asked us to get permission from the patient. And we realized this was a good model because it's not a patient, it's just a model. We were more interested in what goes on in the inside. Here you can see Roberta with her puppet. She's a puppeteer as well. And this is the condition of endoscopic third ventriculoscopy. We make a small opening in the skull and use an endoscope to poke a hole in the floor of the third ventricle. A fairly simple technique. This is what it looks like. This was actually a 4-year-old Brazilian girl who came for treatment of hydrocephalus. And I can't seem to show it, but there's a blockage of the aqueduct of the sylvius, and the floor of the third ventricle is bowed downward, and we came in with an endoscope and made the opening. And this is what it looks like in real life. Here we're coming down through the foramen of the rope. We use different music for different types of cases. This is reggae. And that's the floor of the third ventricle in front of the mammillary body. This is the catheter making an opening. One of the basilar arteries. And there he is. When you remember, you can see that the brain is now pulsing with music. There's the basilar artery. So this is the girl, and she lives in Sao Paulo in Brazil. She was 4 years old. Here she is after the operation, and she's back in Brazil now 12 years later. This is a 4 or 5 millimeter opening in the base of her skull that has kept her going. And the problem is we're working by the brainstem, the basilar artery. There are a lot of structures that can be injured. And so this model that we created really simulates what goes on inside here. Again, the same procedure on a model where the brain can pulsate, the cerebrospinal fluid moves, the vessels move. And Roberta showed this morning, but for those of you who weren't here, here's the simulated model. It's a different song, a little calmer. And we use this to try to train surgeons and students about this technique so that the first time you do it, it's not in the patient's head. And we think it's more accurate than cadaveric models. It can be reused. In the long run, it's cheaper than cadavers and more accurate. And we can bring this to institutions across the world and train surgeons in this technique. So that's the basilar artery. So this is the technique that we developed, and this is Roberta here, who spent countless hours in the lab and in the library developing this pretty much single-handedly. We're here to celebrate her PhD today. She worked with me at Harvard Medical School in Boston, and I subsequently have moved and am now working at Johns Hopkins, which opened its doors in 1889 at the School of Medicine. And for those of you who don't know Johns Hopkins, if you've seen the movie Step Brothers, starring Will Ferrell, he's now being told that, he's 40 years old, being told that his mother has married someone new, he has a new stepfather. He wasn't happy to hear that. Here's what you think.
Where did he go to medical school?
He went to Northwestern and Johns Hopkins. Is that good enough for you?
No, it's not.
Well, Brennan, Those are very prestigious schools.
I smoked pot with Johnny Hopkins.
You don't know anyone named Johnny Hopkins.
It was Johnny Hopkins and Sloan Kettering, and they were blazing that shit up every day.
So that's the introduction to Johns Hopkins, for those who don't know. But right now, it's a bustling medical center with twin towers. The adult tower was built by Sheikh Zayed of Dubai, and the pediatric tower was by Charlotte Bloomberg, the mother of Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York. This is an Arab and a Jew breaking bread together in Baltimore. And that's our hospital. And it's important because this was the birthplace of neurosurgery in the United States when Harvey Cushing finished his residency with William Stewart Halsted and went on to found the field of neurosurgery in 1901 after he spent a year in Europe. In fact, Halsted told him not to do it, that the patients wouldn't survive. But he opened the field and he gave a talk in 1904 about the special field. And that was where neurosurgery began at Johns Hopkins Hospital in the early 1900s. This is the department that we have right now. And I think it's the largest neurosurgery department in the United States. And we work as a team, which is not easy to do in neurosurgery. I've had the good fortune of, fortune brings in some boats that are not steered. And I've had the good fortune of being able to work with some great people. And among them, right in the center, is Mary Vedder. She shows up everywhere, but again, she was the backbone of the simulation project, and she came from your institution right here. What I wanted to talk about today, though, is something different. Neurosurgery is a very highly technical field, but I wanted to talk about the art of neurosurgery, particularly for trainees in the area, because it's easy to lose sight of what that means, the art of neurosurgery, the art of healing. And I think there are 3 H's, humility, humanity, and humor, that are important in the area. I'll try to illustrate that in the remainder of the hour. This is the Society of Neurological Surgeons. It's the oldest neurosurgical society in the world. It was founded by Harvey Cushing in 1920. And here he is speaking with a number of luminaries at their annual meeting. And they faced a number of difficult problems at the time because the instruments were poor, the results were poor, there was a high mortality and morbidity, and that's what they spent their time doing. And last year, I had the honor of being the president of the organization. It was a mixed blessing because I felt that, as this picture is illustrating, I was the tree and this was the cabinet that I worked with. Nevertheless, it's a great organization, and this is Harvey Cushing and Walter Dandy, 2 luminary neurosurgeons, both of whom came from Johns Hopkins. They didn't get along with one another, but they spent their time trying to find ways to safely get their patients through the operation and out of danger. And yet the field has changed in recent decades. And the question is, what has happened to neurosurgery? Here's a case where this is a 29-year-old man who came with back pain and a normal neurological examination. And here's his MRI. It shows a little straightening of the spine, otherwise normal. And here's what happened to him. He had a multi-level fusion from the back and the front. And there's a type of malpractice that we are aware of, which is doing what's unnecessary, or doing what's necessary well, doing what's necessary poorly. But there's another type of malpractice that was described by someone named Norton Hadler in his book, Citizen Patient, which is doing something that's unnecessary well. This is an operation that didn't need to be done, and there's a lot of that going on in my country. Here is a neurosurgeon and president of a hospital last year who lost their jobs for overbilling. One surgeon billed over $80 million in 1 year. This is a neurosurgeon in Detroit who had Medicare fraud and landed a 20-year prison sentence for maiming patients and bilking Medicare. This is a neurosurgeon in Texas who has a life sentence in prison for a drug and alcohol-fueled binge of botched surgeries that left patients maimed or dead. And this poor guy is in prison for the rest of his life. And here's a spine surgeon from Toronto who is earned a life sentence for murdering his wife, the mother of his 3 children, stuffing her in a suitcase where she was found under a bridge in December 2016. So in my opinion, it's time to examine our specialty and try to reclaim it. And the question is, how does this stuff happen? And clearly, there are some people who are sociopathic personalities who have mental health issues. But neurosurgery is a high-stress field, and stress can lead to anxiety, depression, burnout. And there is a conflict of interest between greed and ethics. And there are times when greed trumps ethics. And I think we're seeing some of that in the field. And there are things that we need to be able to do when selecting the neurosurgeons of the future. So the theme of this talk is ars longa vita brevis. And that is a phrase that's written in Latin, but it's ascribed to the great Greek physician Hippocrates from his book Aphorismi. The art is long and the life short. Neurosurgery, unlike most other specialties, requires a lifelong time to understand and learn the techniques that we do. And there's not enough time to learn that information. And so a lot of what we do is passed on from one generation to the next. And it's not only the technical aspects that we're talking about, but the non-technical aspects of healing as well. To illustrate that, here's a story about Harvey Cushing, the founder of the field of neurosurgery, and Wilder Penfield, his disciple, who went on to found the Montreal Neurological Institute. He was Cushing's student. Cushing on the left in 1924, sitting at his desk, writing in his log with a cigarette in one hand. And here Penfield in 1952, years later, in the same pose, and a picture of Cushing, this picture of Cushing on the left on the Penfield's wall. Cushing is the father of neurosurgery. He was born in Cleveland in April 8th, 1869. He was the 10th of 10 children born to Betsy Williams and Henry Kirk Cushing. And he began his career, as I mentioned, at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Here's Wilder Penfield, Wilder Graves Penfield, who was born in Spokane, Washington on January 26, 1891. Went to college at Princeton, became a Rhodes Scholar, moved to Oxford, England, and worked with Sherrington in his lab. Came back and went to medical school at Johns Hopkins, where he came under the influence of Professor William Osler, and then went on to found the Montreal Neurological Institute in 1934. But Penfield, when he was only 37 years old, in December 1928, made a wrenching decision to operate on his own sister, Ruth Inglis, and she was 43 years old, lived in California. She had a year of headaches and vomiting and was found to have papilledema. And there was no MRI at the time. She had a skull x-ray that showed a calcification of the right frontal area. He wanted his mentor Cushing to do the operation, but Cushing was unavailable. His sister took a train to the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, and Penfield was the first neurosurgeon at that area. And he did an operation on his sister under local anesthesia and removed this tumor, which was an oligodendroglioma. And she was given a course of radiation therapy and went back to California relatively well. But 6 months or 2 years later, in 1930, she had recurrent symptoms of bulging of her scalp flap, papilledema, vomiting. And this time she came back to the East Coast on train, and Penfield met her in Boston and had Cushing do the operation. And here, Cushing was a great artist and sketched the procedure. He wrote in his notes that he was embarrassed by the position of the bone flap, thinking that it was too small. Cushing was a tad arrogant. But he did the operation and felt this was an oligodendroblastoma, malignant tumor. And the pathology was read by Louise Eisenhardt. Louise Eisenhardt was Cushing's secretary, who he sent to medical school at Tufts. And she went on to become a neuropathologist and the first president of the Harvey Cushing Society, now the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, and the first editor-in-chief of the Journal of Neurosurgery. She read the pathology as an oligodendroblastoma. And again, Ruth Inglis went back to California, did relatively well. 6 months later, she died of recurrent tumor. And again, Cushing was Penfield's mentor. And Penfield wrote a note to Cushing. Actually, Penfield wrote up his sister's case in the journal Brain in 1935. And he wrote a note of thanks to his mentor Cushing, saying that I want to thank you very much for all you did for her. Simply to postpone death is a very worthwhile for life. When we measure it by weeks and months, it becomes a very precious thing. Powerful words. And then again, Penfield went on to found the Montreal Neurological Institute in 1934, and Cushing was pushed out of Harvard in 1933 and brought his entire library to Yale, where he became the Sterling Professor of Physiology and Neurology at Yale. This was a photo taken of him in Venice by his friend Arnold Klemt, and you can see again that he's got a cigarette in his hand. But Cushing died in 1939 at the age of 70, and shortly before he died, his students held a festschrift for him, and he wrote a letter of thanks to Penfield, where he was lamenting the amount of time it took to become a neurosurgeon, to train in physiology and anatomy and neurology and pathology. And he said that the art is long and the life is short. And again, the words of Hippocrates, ars longa, vita brevis. And so I use that as an introduction to talk about the non-technical aspects of the field of neurosurgery, but I don't for a moment underestimate the importance of the technology. The gifted surgeon Borba here and at the skull base can do things that Cushing and Dandy would never have dreamed of. And this is a book that I did last year on the technical aspects of neurosurgery, how to operate safely and stay out of trouble, and how to get out of trouble when you're in it. And so technology has allowed us to do a lot of things that our forefathers were not able to do. We have MRI, we have intraoperative MRI, we have antibiotics and anticonvulsants and corticosteroids, and we take this for granted. The MRI takes the guesswork out of surgery, and we even have it in the operating room. With the MRI, we can even see papilledema, and here is Joseph Babinski. Some say that with the advent of the MRI, it doesn't matter whether you do the Babinski with the shoe on or the shoe off. The neurologists don't really like to hear that, but the MRI is extremely accurate. We have diffusion tensor imaging that can show us fiber tracts. And my area of interest has been in minimally invasive neurosurgery, where we can take out selected tumors through small tubes, the same kind of stuff that Dr. Redder developed a training model for. Here is resection of a colloid cyst blocking the foramen of Monroe. So there's no question that technology has allowed us to make advances in the field, but technology comes with a price. It can drive a wedge between the doctor and the patient. And in the words of the great William Osler, listen to the patient. He is telling you the diagnosis. There's a lot of tests that we can do, but a good history and physical exam is paramount in importance, and often because we're so busy, we're unable to take the time to do that. Technology has led physicians to trivialize the importance of bedside manner. This poor dog seen better days, it looks like, and the importance of the complex involvement between patients and the doctor is rarely discussed in medical school and medical school texts. Now, this is an interesting picture. And there's a HIPAA violation in this picture. That's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act that was brought in 1996 by President Bill Clinton as a means to protect patients. And the HIPAA violation is not the fact that he's bearing his nipple here. This is a resident of mine who was celebrating his birthday by wearing his birthday suit. The HIPAA violation is this bulletin board in the back, one of 8 that I had in my office, showcasing pictures of my patients sent to me by their families for them to be proudly displayed. But because I didn't have written permission from each parent, this is a HIPAA violation. And in my opinion, that's absurd. And I think the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction. We call this meaningful use in the United States. And I think in some ways, meaningful use has become meaningless. We've become so obsessed with coding and charting and electronic health records that we're losing sight of what it means to take care of the patients. For those of you who have had an opportunity to drink Dos Equis beer, you may recognize this fellow, Jonathan Goldsmith, who was called the most interesting man in the world. He was part of an advertisement for the beer. And here it says, I don't always get sucked into a jet engine, but when I do, I use ICD-10 code B97.33XD. Sounds pretty ridiculous, but what's more ridiculous is that ICD-10 code B97.33XD is a real code being sucked into a jet engine subsequent encounter. We spend so much time coding that we've lost sight of what it means to take care of the patients. Here's an example of the electronic medical record. And the advantage of this is that we can transmit messages from one institution to another, and it certainly has major advantages. But the way it's being used is being auto-populated by cutting and pasting. It's become kind of a sterile billing technique, and it's devoid of originality, and it's garbage in, garbage out. We don't believe much of what we read in it. And if any of you have ever been a patient before, sometimes you can look at the back of the doctor's head as he or she is entering your data in a computer. And I think it's important to from time to time, recognize that it's necessary to take your hands off the keyboard and put them on the patient. The laying on of the hands, touching the patient, is an art that has been lost. And sometimes the simplest things that we do are the ones that are most remembered by the patients and their family. And there is a certain unique reward that one gets by developing a bond with the patient and the family that is greater than anything that money can buy. So the art of neurosurgery, the 3 H's: humility, humanity, and humor. Humility is an essential part of the art of healing, but it's not a word that is in the lexicon of many neurosurgeons. And I wanted to talk again about why this is so important. And this is a story about my dad. My dad was a doctor, and he grew up in poverty in the Lower East Side of New York. Went on to graduate first in his class in medical school, something that he never told my mother. She found out years later from somebody else. Unfortunately, the humility gene did not seem to get transmitted to me. And I grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York. This is in 1906, a little before my time, a town about 70 miles north of New York City. I went to public schools and somehow miraculously was accepted to Harvard. And this was my dorm at Harvard. And I was feeling kind of overwhelmed because the people there just didn't come from the boondocks like me. This was F. Skitty von Stad, who was the dean of freshmen. And I was just a country guy thrown into Harvard. And my classmates had names like, oh, here's me, a frizzy-haired guy from the middle of nowhere at Harvard University, way over my head. And my classmates, this was a guy, the Viscount Slane from Slane Castle in Ireland. I didn't know how to compete with these people. This was another one of my classmates, Walter Isaacson, looks like a little guy from New Orleans. But he went on to become a Rhodes Scholar, former CEO of CNN, the managing editor of Time, and you probably recognize him from the biographies he'd written. And here I was, a little guy from Poughkeepsie, New York at Harvard, and I was kind of feeling overwhelmed until midway in my second semester at college, I got a note that I was going to be awarded the Edwards Whitaker Scholarship. And I told my mom. She was thrilled about this, and she told pretty much everybody in my hometown of Poughkeepsie. I was feeling pretty good until a couple weeks later when I got the letter from Harvard that said that I would be awarded a scholarship in the amount of $13.50. That's maybe 30 reals here. And so I thought, well, maybe Harvard's view of my scholarship was not consistent with my own. But this did teach me a lesson about humility, which is one of the central themes of what I'm speaking about. Humility is under-recognized as a powerful part of the art of healing. And in the words of the great Yogi Berra, it ain't the heat, it's the humility. Humility is from humilis, the act of being humble or modest. Again, a word not in the lexicon of many of us in neurosurgery. This is Moses Maimonides from the 1100s, a great medieval philosopher, teacher, rabbi, and physician. He said, "May I never forget that the patient is a fellow creature in pain. May I never treat him merely as a vessel of disease." Very powerful words, and it's easy to forget that. And it applies not only to taking care of adults, but in my field, pediatric neurosurgery to taking care of patients as well. I learned that lesson when I was training with Fred Epstein, who was a luminary pediatric neurosurgeon in New York, and we had operated on a young 7-year-old girl 3 times in 3 weeks for a shunt malfunction, one of the simplest operations we do. And she wrote us a letter, and it said, Dr. Cohen and Epstein, this better be the last damn fucking operation this week. 3 is plenty. And P.S. you don't deserve the gifts I had for you. And to illustrate the impact that this has on the entire family, she had spelled the word fucking wrong, but her mother corrected the spelling. So don't underestimate the power of a child. This is C.S. Lewis, the great British novelist and poet, who said humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And I think the biggest violators of this, no offense to Professor Borba, but the skull-based surgeons, his friend and colleague, Al-Defti, who I work with, usually looks at himself in the mirror after every skull-based clival chordoma that he takes care of. But I kid about that. But sometimes you can recognize humility by what it's not. It's the opposite of narcissism. And of course, for those of you who've seen the movie Anchorman, I don't know how to put this, but I'm kind of a big deal. That's the way a lot of people think about neurosurgeons. Another lesson I learned about this was early in my career, 1974, when I met Philippe Petit. You probably heard about him. He was the French high wire artist. In August 1974, he strung a 450-pound steel cable between the twin towers of the World Trade Center in New York, 1,360 feet above the ground, and he spent 45 minutes walking across this. He knelt down on it, he jumped on it, he lay down on it, he waved to the crowd, and he got to the other side and was promptly arrested. But the fine was let go if he agreed to perform for young kids in the park, and he did that. And I used to watch him when I was a medical student, and he did a juggling act. He's recently done a TED Talk, but he was a master juggler as well. So this was Philippe Petit, and he would perform riding a unicycle in an area. He had hundreds of people gathered around him, and I used to watch him to try to decompress from toils and tribulations of being a medical student. At the time, I was studying magic and juggling with the janitor's family in my dormitory, thinking about maybe a career in the European circus. And I was watching Petit. He was riding around in a unicycle. He was dressed in all black, a mime artist as well. And he stopped in front of me and he started juggling 2 balls with one hand, and he motioned to me to take the balls. And I felt that there was something bad about this, and I tried to decline, but the crowd was roaring and asked me to do it. Finally, I thought he didn't know that I had studied juggling myself, and this is a pretty easy move. But I took the balls and juggled them, and the crowd went wild and they were applauding, and he was surprised, and he grabbed the balls and went into the center of the ring, and I was smiling and feeling pretty proud of myself until he held up my wristwatch, which he had taken off my hand in full view of everybody without me knowing it. And I was terribly embarrassed. And but again, another lesson in humility. Don't overestimate your own importance. So the first of the 3 H's is humility. Second is humanity. This is a picture of Ernest Sirianni, who was a country doctor in 1948. It was a photo essay in Life magazine. Photographer was a famous William Eugene Smith. He took this picture in 1948 and followed the doctor. He was the only doctor for about 1,000 patients. It was 100 miles west of Denver in Kremling, Colorado. And the problem is not that we want to get rid of the MRI and the PET scan and the fusion tensor imaging, but we need to have some of the doctor-patient relationship return. This is Luke Fildus from Liverpool painted this. The doctor in 1891 sitting at the bedside of an alien patient. And we tend to lose sight of that in this technology-driven era. Humanity is equanimitas, and equanimitas was the word coined by William Osler in his valedictory address at at the University of Pennsylvania in 1889, where he left there to become the first professor of medicine at the newly opened Johns Hopkins Hospital. Equanimitas means equanimity, or calmness amid storm, clearness of judgment in times of great peril. And Osler was really the father of modern medicine. He was the first professor at Johns Hopkins. And in this valedictory address that he gave Equanimitas at the University of Pennsylvania, he reminded us that the good physician treats the disease, but the great physician treats the patient who has the disease. He had a way of coining very memorable phrases. He was one of the 4 founding physicians at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and he created the first residency program in the entire world. And he was the father of modern medicine, the first person to bring medical students out of the classroom to the bedside. And he said, "He who studies medicine without books sails an uncharted sea, but he who studies medicine without patients never goes to sea at all." Very powerful words from a physician who is still remembered today. So that's part of the art of healing. There's a distinction between treating and healing. And compassion without technology will not treat, but technology without compassion will not heal. We are not treating a disease, we're trying to heal the patient. And the great Mark Twain said, "I have too much respect for the truth than to drag it out on every trifling occasion." But the challenge is that there's a balance between honesty and hope, and sometimes that's different for different patients. And the physician has to choose the best balance for each case. This is Edward Livingston Trudeau, and he was a medical student at Columbia University in New York in 1871 when he was 20 years old. His brother contracted pulmonary tuberculosis. He had to withdraw from medical school to take care of his ailing brother, who died, and then he himself contracted tuberculosis. He got his medical degree, but this was in the late 1800s. There was no bacterial treatment for tuberculosis. So he moved to upstate New York to Saranac Lake in the Adirondack Mountains to be in the fresh air. He was the great-grandfather of Gary Trudeau of Doonesbury fame. And he opened a sanatorium in upstate New York in the Adirondack Mountains at Saranac Lake, where he treated a number of people, including the author Robert Louis Stevenson. Again, the patients flocked to him for good food, cold weather, clear air, and compassion. And this invigorating climate is what helped several of his patients heal. But again, there was no bacterial treatment. And then Trudeau died in 1915. And at the time of his death, 1,500 of his grateful patients got together and erected a statue in his honor, which still stands at Saranac Lake. And there was bronze on marble. This was the sculptor. Anybody know who this guy is? John Gutzon Borglum. Pardon? He's a Danish-American sculptor. He's famed for creating America's Shrine of Democracy in the Black Hills of South Dakota, Mount Rushmore. For those of you who've had an opportunity to see this from the Canadian side. And this is the statue, bronze on marble, and on the back were the words French, the title of his biography, translated to English. To cure sometimes, to relieve often, to comfort always. And in our busy careers, we tend to lose sight of that third part of that phrase, that aphorism. It was actually first described in the 1500s by a French surgeon, André Perret. So the art of healing. Technology treats the disease, but humanity heals the patient. It's important to find the right balance there. Now, that is nowhere more important than when we're giving bad news to a patient. We often are not trained in the technique of delivering bad news. I have had an opportunity to give a lot of bad news, and I was asked to teach a clerkship in this in medical school. The experience is that marvelous thing that allows you to recognize a mistake when you make it again. I've made a share of my mistakes, and here I would show the medical students a vignette of me giving bad news to parents of a young child who I've removed a medulloblastoma from the fourth ventral. This is a small round blue cell tumor a malignant tumor, the most common malignant tumor of childhood. But we've made great strides in treating medulloblastoma. Here I have two actors that I'm speaking to, and sometimes you can learn about how to do something the right way by seeing it done the wrong way. So there are several things that you might be able to find that I did wrong in this. See if you can pick up anything that I could have done better.
Well, little Johnny's biopsy came back, and it's big and it's bad.
Benji?
Oh, I'm sorry, Benji, yeah. But anyway, the biopsy's back, and it's cancer. It's a bad cancer, and I'm sorry to have to tell you that.
What does that mean for him?
How long does that mean? Is he gonna make it, or does he only have to?
Look, I just spent 4 hours operating, okay? He made it, but it's cancer. This is a malignant tumor, and we're gonna have to talk about that later, okay? In fact, I did a beautiful operation. This was probably the best operation I ever did, but, you know, I didn't put it there.
Does that mean that this is gonna come back?
Hang on 1 second.
Killing?
I got a call coming in. I'll tell you about this in 1 second. Look, I know you guys are, hang on.
Wait a minute.
Hi, honey.
Hey, I wanna know about my kid.
Listen, I'm in the middle of something right now. Yeah, I'll be there. I just gotta get rid of a couple. Hang on 1 second. I'll be there. And try, I love you. I love you too.
Hey.
And try to wear that thing that you wore the last time. Okay. I'm sorry. Look, where were we? Do you guys have any questions?
You're telling me my kid has cancer.
I know, and you're upset. This is a normal reaction, but we're gonna work through this, okay?
Normal reaction, of course it's a normal reaction. But you're acting like it's no big deal.
It's a big deal, but I'm having a little trouble handling this right now. I think it's better that we talk when you guys calm down a little bit.
It's our son.
Okay, but your son, but he's not the only patient I'm taking care of, right?
He's our only
He should be
son.
your primary concern.
Well, I just spent 4 hours operating, okay? He's a little boy, big tumor, and I'll come back and talk to you later, okay?
American son of a bitch, you're talking about my son.
Look, honey, sit down.
Don't call me honey.
I know you're
Is he
upset.
gonna be okay or not?
I can't tell you that. It's not a perfect science. I'm a surgeon, right? I didn't put the tumor there, right?
Excuse me, I think I'm taking a paycheck for that nice house that you have. You can at least give me some information.
Hello, look, did I put the tumor there? I'm
No,
a
you
surgeon.
didn't put the tumor there, but neither do we. We just want some information
Okay.
from you. Is he
Well,
gonna be
You
okay
guys
or
are a
not?
little too hot under the collar to talk now, so I'm gonna come back and talk later, okay? I'm sorry he's got a tumor, okay? And I'll come back and talk later.
I told him.
So I showed that to a group of neurosurgeons in New York, and one of the people in the audience, the chairman of neurosurgery at New York University, said, "I thought it was pretty good. I think you could have sat down, but otherwise I thought it was pretty good." So everybody has an interpretation of what to do. But again, sometimes you can see what not to do and help you learn what to do. The art of healing, I try to simplify it by Leonardo da Vinci. Listen, empathize, and offer hopes. 3 simple things. Sometimes when I speak to a group and look in the audience, this is what they look like. Listening is an active process, and it's my role to make sure that I'm able to connect with you to keep you awake. As the great poet W.H. Auden said, that a professor is one who talks in someone else's sleep. And often I find myself in that situation. But listening is an active process. Probably more important than what you say is what you hear. In fact, famous oncologist from the University of Toronto, Robert Buckman, said, before you talk, hear. And you want to listen beyond the chief complaint. Look at the patient's body language. How much do they want to know? Or even talk about if the tests come back and this is something serious, how much do you want to know about it? You try to develop a connection between you and the patient. It's not your job to sugarcoat a bad situation, but to share the good and the bad news with the patient. And that's the second E is empathize. And this was Francis Weld Peabody, who said that the secret of the care of the patient is in caring for the patient. Peabody was the head of the Thorndike Medical Library, or the Thorndike Medical Laboratory at Harvard. He was speaking to the graduating class at Harvard Medical School in 1927. The secret of the care of the patient is in caring for the patient. And caring, described by Albert Johnson, a bioethicist, means being troubled by another's trouble. It means that there's more than one way to give information. If someone comes in with a cervical spine fracture, dislocation, and quadriplegic, it may be true to say it's hopeless, you'll never walk again. But if you were to say most people with this injury don't walk again, it's received by the patient in a vastly different manner. And again, the doctor's role is to leave some degree of hope open. So empathy is an important thing. It's difficult to describe, but it's like the United States Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart describing pornography. I know it when I see it. And with empathy, patients know it when it's not there. Everybody displays this differently, but if you don't care about the patient really realizes that. Offer hope. Hope is the third and perhaps equally important concept in the art of healing. And talk is one of the most underrated tools in the doctor's armamentarium. Optimism is a moral imperative in what we do, and talk can be therapeutic. Even when the outlook is doubtful, affirmative words can promote well-being, and there's an art to trying to find a way to do this, not to give false hope, but to give some hope. Grateful that the tests show that there's no involvement elsewhere in the body. Something positive to say will help the patient walk away. In the words of Rudyard Kipling, words, of course, are the most powerful drug used by mankind. He said this in 1923, giving an address to the Royal College of Surgeons in London. And as we're coming to the end of the book, this is Viktor Frankl, an Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist, a Holocaust survivor. He lost his mother, his brother, and his wife in concentration camps. And he wrote a book, Man's Search for Meaning. And people asked him how he was able to survive. And he said that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Very powerful words, and by a Holocaust survivor. So now we have humility and humanity, and the final H, the art of healing, in my mind, is humor. And Voltaire said the art of medicine consists in amusing the patient while nature cures the disease. That may not be entirely correct, but there is a role for humor in medical care. And it means not standing at the bedside of a patient in the intensive care unit telling jokes, but making yourself vulnerable. My office is a little unconventional. Roberta helped me decorate it, and I am one of the people who believes that Elvis is alive. And each year, on January 8th, Elvis's birthday, we get together and have a karaoke celebration with my brain tumor patients who have never heard of Elvis but are fearless, and we celebrate. And there's things that you can do to make yourself vulnerable. Here was a carnival they had where my patients could line up and throw a ball and dunk me. And they learned out that they didn't have to throw the ball, they could just stand here and push this button. I was giving so. But by making yourself vulnerable, it makes you more human. And even in the Old Testament, there's the word that a merry heart doeth good like a medicine. So humor is vitamin H. And here I'm dressed as the king. I have no talent whatsoever, but we do a karaoke celebration, and the kids are fearless in this.
Who knew that the King's music could heal in very special ways? You're going to meet a doctor who says that he trades in his green operating scrubs for a jumpsuit every now and then, and sometimes that makes all the difference for his patients.
So here's one. This is the patient that I showed you earlier, the girl from Brazil who had the endoscopic third ventricular. I can guarantee you she had no idea who Elvis was, but she was fearless. And even, this applies not only to kids, but to adults, and probably Professor Zanone recognizes some of the people, Dr. Boop and Dr. Duhane, dressed in Elvis memorabilia, some of the leaders in pediatric neurosurgery worldwide. And here, again, there's only so far you can go with no talent.
I want to let you know that I do weddings and bar mitzvahs, and if people are interested, book early because I do have a complicated FOBAR schedule I've got to coordinate with.
Be on the left. So humor. This is Osler at the bedside of a stricken child. And again, warmth is often unspoken. It's part of the art of healing. You want to share hope, share disappointment. Sometimes doing something so little as adjusting the patient's sheets or pillow can go a long way. So I began with Ars Longa, Vita Brevis is the end. The art is long, life is short. This is Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. And he gave the graduation address at Stanford University in 2005. And that was 6 years before his untimely death at the age of 56 on October 5th, 2011, of metastatic pancreatic cancer. He said, your time is limited, so don't waste it trying to live someone else's life. You're young in medical school, your careers are ahead of you. You want to work hard, but you need to find a way to enjoy what you do. This is a boy, David, who was applying to college. And at his college interview, he developed sudden weakness of his right arm, and then bad headache with vomiting and obtundation, collapsed. He was sent by life flight to our hospital where he had this hemorrhagic tumor in the center of his brain. We were able to remove the tumor, but the technical aspects where we use motor mapping and image guidance are not what I wanted to talk about. Listen to what it's like from the parent, this very strong father of this child who was broken by what happened.
There isn't any way to explain it. I mean, you take your child's life and you hand it over to someone, and you are totally helpless to have anything to do with what happens. And we will forever. And I mean, and you can tell today, it's just about as emotional and meaningful as it was 8 years ago. And it probably always will be.
Very moving words from a very powerful man. Fortunately, this story has a happy ending. This was 21 years ago, and David is now a graduate of college, works for the Department of Defense. He's married. He has 3 children of his own, and this is why we're able to do what we do. So it's getting late. I'm going to bring this to a close. The art of neurosurgery: humility, humanity, and humor, the 3 H's. And the practice of neurosurgery is one of the most remarkable and rewarding endeavors in all of medicine. And the ability to alleviate pain and suffering and restore health to a ailing, sometimes critically ill patient is an extraordinary gift granted to a limited number of people. I feel very lucky to be a pediatric neurosurgeon, to be able to share the lives and dreams of these courageous young heroes of mine who've taught me more about the art of neurosurgery than I would have learned in books. And remember the words of Penfield: life, when we measure it by weeks or months, becomes a very precious thing. So in summary, work hard, be nice to people. Remember the words of the philosopher Goethe: treat people as if they were what they ought to be, and you'll help them become what they're capable of being. So be humble, treat people kindly, and don't forget to enjoy the ride and get this to work.
Somewhere, even Elvis must be
Falling in love with you, for I can't help falling in love with you.
So thank you very much for the honor of speaking at this wonderful university, and congratulations to my wonderful friend and colleague and a graduate of this medical center, Roberta Redder. Thank you very much.
Lição de vida. Uma outra forma de falar, beleza, como nós médicos devemos ser, não na neurocirurgia, em todas as áreas, ensinamento de vida, ensinamento de alegria. Isso eu acho importante, a mensagem final que ele deixou. O médico, às vezes, é um pouco cascudo. Nós devemos, sabe, dar uma esperança, uma alegria, aquilo que ele disse, dar a esperança. Nós não podemos ter nada mais para fazer, por que não? Dar uma esperança, nem que seja pequena. A pessoa se agarra naquilo como uma tábua de salvação e alivia o final, normalmente está próximo. Eu achei magnífica a conferência. Não se presta à neurocirurgia, mas sim se presta a toda a atividade médica, que todos nós somos ou ganhamos acesso à cultura. Muito obrigado, professor Cohen. É emocionante nós termos uma palestra como essa em ambiente universitário aqui em Curitiba. Muito obrigado. Thank you very much for coming. My pleasure. Está encerrada a sessão. Muito obrigado.